But we don't have to rush through it, Rabbi.
Yeah, I know, for sure. And I really do.
There's always stuff to talk about.
This story in particular is one of those ones where, sometimes we rush through it so fast, it's ridiculous. And I almost want to say, we're not going to read this because it's not, you're doing such a disservice to it that, and actually this last year for High Holidays, because we did such a abbreviated version, we really didn't even get into this part of the story because
we really didn't.
You can't. It's disrespectful to read part of it. And I talked to other rabbis in synagogues what they were doing with the Torah service. I'm like, you can't do that. You can't. This isn't a joke. You can't read a little piece of this like it's you're skimming the newspaper. This is a story with so many layers and so many elements to it. So we're gonna take a look.
And I think I told you, Rabbi, that Sedona Rabbi Elisha Magal won't read this.
Yeah, I have to say that's kind of, I mean I think I understand why, but that's kind of even a lot of Reform synagogues that were not reading this, they were reading the story of creation, have gone back to reading the story because they realize that as hard as it is to read, it's important to read. And the reason that it was kind of selected by the rabbis to be read at High Holidays is because it's so important. And it's such a kind of a vital understanding of faith and of what it means to kind of feel like, what does God really want of us, which is kind of what the High Holidays is really essentially about. So, again, it's also about celebrating the beginning of the year and the beginning of new time and a new cycle of time. But there's also the reason that we do it in a religious way is because we're asking the deep questions. So we're actually, let me share this up right now, because where we left off, we actually, let Sarah Renson in. We're speaking of artists, another artist in the family. We also want to take a look at where we left off, which is just before that. We read 2 weeks ago the story of how Ishmael was thrown out of the house, if you will. And the last thing that we read was that his mother got him a wife from the land of Egypt, which is where she was from. So it kind of makes sense that Hagar went to Egypt and got a wife from him, from her people. Ishmael pretty much disappears, but not completely. So I do want to tell you, this is not the end of Ishmael. Ishmael will make another brief appearance, and we do deal with Ishmael a little bit. Again, we have a couple people with us here on Facebook now. So it says God was with the boy, and he grew up and he dwelt in the wilderness, and that's kind of where we left off. He became a bowman, and that is the ancestor of the Arab people. But the next section where we left off, it says, at that time, Avimelech and Phicol, chief of his troops, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. And this harkens back to what we read about before, which is Avimelech, the king of the Canaanites, one of the kings of the Canaanites in Shechem, makes a pact with Abraham after Abraham has kind of tricked him or been in another situation where Sarah marries Avimelech for a short period of time, lives with Avimelech, and then he realizes that he is taken someone else's wife, returns her, and they kind of make peace at that point. But Avimelech here takes another step forward, which is he goes to Abraham and says, God is with everything you do. And so he says to Abraham, therefore swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my kith and kin, which is kind of an interesting translation, but there is this kind of phrase here, ul nini ul which is with my people, but it's two words. So kith and kin kind of work for the translation. But we'll deal with me, and then because then it continues, and deal with me and with my land in which you have sojourned as loyally as I have dealt with you. And so he basically wants Abraham's protection because he realizes that Abraham seems to have a special relationship with God. So he says, you know, hey, I don't really know how it works, but you seem to be doing well. So we're not going to hurt you. Please help us and treat us well. And Abraham said, I swear it. Then Abraham reproached Avimelech for the well of water, which the servants of Avimelech had seized. But Avimelech said, I do not know who did this. You did not tell me, nor have I heard of it until this day. And that's true. We didn't hear about this well being seized. And so Avimelech says, I didn't know about it. You didn't bring it to my attention. And so he says, you know, I didn't know, you know, now you brought it to my attention. Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Avimelech, and the two of them made a pact. Abraham then set 7 ewes of the flock by themselves. And Avimelech said to Abraham, what mean these 7 ewes that you have set them apart? And he replied, you are to accept these 7 ewes from me as proof as I dug this well. Hence the place is called Beersheba, for the two of them swore an oath. And so what it says is that this well is a well that Abraham dug. And Abraham is saying, this is my well. And it's my well. First, he doesn't say you can't use it, but he says it's my well. And he calls it Beersheba, which means literally the well of pact, but it also means the well of 7. So there's a double meaning to this well, because the word Sheva in Hebrew means both 7 and it means an oath. So it has Shvuot are weeks, but Shavuot also mean vows. So it's part of when we say Kol Nidre, we say Kol Shavuot. It's also one of the synonyms for a vow, like a neder, like a vow, a promise. So the well is the well of promise, of oath, of swearing an oath, but it's also the well of 7 baby lambs. And when they concluded the pact at Beersheba, Avimelech and Phicol, the chief of his troops, departed and returned to the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted a tamarisk at Beersheba and invoked there the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And it says Abraham resided in the land of the Philistines a long time. Yeah, I forgot. Here, Avimelech is referred to as the Philistine. It is maybe an anachronism because we don't know that the Philistines lived during the time of Abraham in the land of Israel. We know that they're there when the Israelites come back from Egypt. It's not that important because at the time when this was either written or taught, everyone understood that the Philistines were living in this land. So there is that maybe problem that the Philistines are referred to here. I wouldn't say it's a huge problem, but people do point it out as a possible anachronism that shouldn't be there. But at least there's this idea that Abraham took another level of ownership or responsibility for the land, and that he digs wells and he takes the wells and he names the wells, but that he also, as it says, plants a tree, a tamarisk tree. And in Hebrew, that's an eshel tree. And the interesting thing about Abraham is he doesn't build cities. He digs wells and he plants trees. Right? So he doesn't build cities. He takes care of the land. He nurtures the land so that his future descendants will be able to have a place to live and a place where there's water, where there's life. And that has been one of the important ideas in In Judaism, whether it's the modern nation of Israel with the Jewish National Fund, which started even before there was a nation of Israel. The Jewish National Fund started even before 1948. Jews were already raising money and trying to figure out how to revitalize the land. And in about a week, we celebrate Tu B'Shvat, the time of planting trees and counting how old the trees are. It's the birthday of the trees, right? Jewish Arbor Day, and it's in about a week from now. So it's definitely appropriate to think about our connection to the land of Israel, to nature, to trees, and the fact that Avraham, that's what he does, is he plants trees and he digs wells. That's Avraham's responsibility. So that's the end of chapter 21. And then as we move into chapter 22, there's a question of what happens here as far as the transition into voice of the Bible, authorship of the Bible, all of those things that people want to look at when they kind of study what happens. Chapter 22 was without a doubt one of the most unique parts of the Bible, definitely one of the most unique parts of the book of Genesis. It's one of the most studied parts of Genesis next to creation. The binding of Isaac we read, as we said, at high holidays, at Rosh Hashanah. It's also kind of invoked even in daily prayer, traditionally in Orthodox Judaism. The binding of Isaac is oftentimes part of the daily service, because it's such an important testament to Abraham's faith and to what happens when Abraham, in this critical moment, steps up into a new dynamic with God. Just to refresh our memories and to see what's happened, only 10 chapters ago, and it seems like a lot longer because we've been reading it at a slower pace. Only 10 chapters ago, we were introduced. In chapter 12, we're introduced to Abraham. And we see Abraham being told to go to the promised land, to go to a land that God is promising him. And over the last few weeks, months actually, we've seen Abraham go down to Egypt when there's a famine. His wife gets taken by Pharaoh and then returned to him. He leaves Egypt, goes back to the land of Israel. He has a dispute with his nephew Lot. They go in different directions. He goes and rescues Lot when Lot is taken captive along with the people of Sodom and the other cities. We've seen him have another covenant with God. We've seen him be visited by God after he circumcises himself and his household. And we hear Abraham argue on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah, if they're innocent people there, that they should be spared. And then we kind of leave Abraham for a little bit as we go to Sodom and Gomorrah with Lot and with the family in chapter 19. And then the last couple of chapters, we had another story of Abraham with Avimelech, and a story similar to the story with Pharaoh, where Avimelech takes Sarah. And then we read the story of Sarah essentially kicking out Hagar and Ishmael out of the house. And now we come here. Now we come to chapter 22. And Abraham at this point is somewhere in his hundreds. We don't know exactly how old, because we don't know how long this took. The opening line in chapter 22, sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. And he said to him, Abraham, and he answered, Hineni, here I am. And he said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. So let's just take a moment to take in those first two verses of this story. There is so much in these verses to look at, to dissect, to consider, to reflect on. The first is, as I said, we have no idea how long has passed between the previous verse and this verse. So we have no idea how old Abraham is. And more importantly, we have no idea how old Isaac is. Because you can make the argument, Abraham might be 110, he might be 120, he might be 130. We don't know how old he is. But you make the argument that he's 100, 110. It's not a huge difference. How old Isaac is a big difference. And we don't know. We don't know. And as we get introduced to Isaac at this age, we're not sure either. But we'll talk about that when we get to Isaac. We don't know how much time has passed. We also know right from the beginning that this is a test. It says God tested him. Abraham is going to be tested. Nisa et Abraham. The word Nisa means he's being tested. So we know that he's being tested. So the question of whether God ever meant this, whether this was meant to, God changes his mind at the last moment, that's not what it says. The text says that this is a test. And of course, we get to this moment where God says to Abraham, just calls him out by name, and Abraham says, Hineni. So Abraham's ability to say Hineni, here I am, is critical. And again, the word is so important to us in the Bible, as we've talked about already, even though we're only in chapter 22. Whenever we see the word Hineni, we know something important is about to happen. Whenever anybody says the word Hineni, it means more than just here I am. And it's why sometimes some Bible translations don't even translate it anymore, because it means so much more than just here I am. It means I'm ready. It means I probably don't want to hear what I'm about to hear, but I'm going to listen anyways. And again, it's one of the hardest things for human beings to say, because it means I'm present, I'm aware, I'm in the moment, I'm going to probably have to do something that I don't want to deal with right now. And the translation that Friedman uses from his Bible is I'm here. Now, I'm here is nowhere near as poetic as here I am. But I'm here, in English at least, especially in modern English, really does have a connotation of being I'm present. I'm here means when someone says to you, where are you? That you say, I'm here. So if you say, here I am, kind of is like, it's not as powerful in a way. It's not as commanding and authoritative and resounding as saying, I'm here, right? Here I am. Like if somebody called you, right? Where are you? You say, here I am. It's almost like, I'm kind of here, right? It's almost like, here I am. It's like if someone's looking for you and you're playing hide and seek, you go, here I am. It's almost can be playful. It can almost be, well, you can kind of find me, but I'm here isn't a question. There's no question that I'm here. So this is his being called for his mission. And of course, then we have this, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love. So let's look at that phrase. Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love. Right? So a lot of people say, what's with that, right? What's with your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love? Why so many words to describe Isaac? Why doesn't it just say, take Isaac? Right? Now, the translation that they gave us is not a great translation for this reason. It actually ends with Yitzchak, right? Because the rabbinic teaching on this, the midrash, is that there's a conversation that goes back and forth between God and Avraham. God says, Kachna et bincha, take now your son. And Avraham says, which son? And he says, your yechidcha, your chosen one. Let me see what this translation says. Your only one. Yachid comes from the word echad, so it could be your only one. Yachad, right here, together, you're one. And he says to God, I have more than one son. And he says, Asher ahavta, the one you love. And he says, I love both of my sons. I love my children. And then finally, God says, et Yitzchak. So you have to read it in the Hebrew in order to get that midrash, right? Kachna et bincha, your son, et yechidcha, your chosen one, your only one, the one you love, Yitzchak. Now, whether that midrash, which is a wonderful midrash of Avraham kind of arguing with God that I love both of my sons, there is another wonderful buildup, regardless, in this phrase, because Avraham has been waiting his whole life. Sarah has been waiting her whole life. I mean, beyond a normal bounds of a life, to have a child. And now God is saying, take your child and offer him up. And God, by recognizing your son, this child, this only child, this one that you love, Isaac, that this is a tremendous burden. Everybody with us so far? Yes.
Yeah,
There's a
there
lot.
seems like there is a feeling of almost accusing him of of not really loving Ishmael, or are thinking of Ishmael as his son, and certainly not as his chosen one.
So you weren't here with us 2 weeks ago, Sarah, but that's exactly the point that we made, which is, why does this test happen now? And the rabbis are kind of throwing out this possibility that Avraham must now take responsibility and essentially ownership of the fact that he has sent away Ishmael, which it doesn't seem like he really wants to do, yet he does. And God says it'll be okay. But at this moment, maybe his inability to save Ishmael from being sent away is now part of what caused this test to be called on in the first place, which is that this is now, he is being tested. He gave up a son.
Yeah, it's like, if you were so willing to give up him, would you be as willing to give up Isaac, the one that you really love?
Correct. And that's why we have this midrash, because the rabbis knew that story just happened. That's literally the previous chapter. So the juxtaposition of those two stories actually then calls us to say, does Ishmael have anything to do with this? Does Ishmael's disappearance and being sent away have anything to do? Because really at this moment, I mean, God's told him he'll be okay, but we don't know that he knows that. We don't know. Did this is the question, right? Abraham's put to a test here. Is he being put to a test because he failed the previous test? Was that a test that isn't necessarily God's test, but a test that Sarah threw at him, a test of life, if you will? And did he fail that test? And so does God now try to put him to the test to see what's really going on here? So at least the rabbis give that as a possibility, that that's what happens, right? And again, It works better in the Hebrew when you don't throw Isaac before that. Now, again, in translation, Isaac, whom you love, that's all probably better English, because if you say, take your son, your favorite one, whom you love, comma, Isaac, it's probably not as, doesn't read as well in English, but with the Hebrew, you don't have to do that. Now, the other problem here in translation is that the next words, V'lech lecha el eretz hamoriyah, if you don't translate, I mean, how do you translate the words lech lecha without thinking about the previous time we heard lech lecha, right? That's the name of the portion in chapter 12 that we're first introduced to Abraham, right? Lech lecha, go get yourself, go take yourself, however you want to translate the words lech lecha, which are powerful in themselves. And that lechi lach is this whole song written about lech lecha, about going and taking yourself out of this place. Those words come back in this portion. And most people don't talk about that, right? Just an example, if we're reading this fast, we might not talk about lech lecha coming back. It's not a common phrase, folks. It's not the way we normally say to somebody, go. We don't normally say lech lecha. It's a very unique phrase in the Bible. And here we have Avraham being told twice, lech lecha. Once when he goes on his journey to the promised land, and the next to go to our Eretz Moriah, to this place, the land of Moriah, which we don't know for sure where Moriah is. I will tell you, we really don't. But the assumption by the rabbis and what the rabbis wanted was that this was actually Jerusalem, that the place where he is being taken to is Mount Moriah, another name for Mount Zion, another name for Jerusalem, another name for the Temple Mount. And so this was a very important part of Jewish tradition, that Isaac is told to be sacrificed in that spot where the temple would be. Important, obviously, for Jewish history, critically important for world history as the assumption of what would happen at that place later on in history. So doesn't say it specifically here. Was it a later Judean tradition, that was the same spot? Possibly. That was going to be one of King David's most important institutions and revolutions, which we'll be talking about on our Tuesday morning class, what King David does, making Jerusalem the capital of the Jewish people. So this connection to Abraham and Isaac, pretty important. And again,
does Moriah mean anything?
Moriah?
Yeah, Moriah.
So yeah, the question of what does it mean? Look, as we've talked about before, we don't know. Mountains in Israel are oftentimes, well, I shouldn't just say in Israel, right? Because Mount Sinai, we don't know exactly where that is either, right? There is there's a tradition, and again, it's interesting because Muslims also have a similar tradition that this is where Ishmael, in their version, it's Ishmael was almost sacrificed. So they have a version with Ishmael, not Isaac. In their tradition, of course, Marwa is near Mecca. But we really don't know until, I'm going to tell you right now, until it's not in the book of Samuel, where we get Har Moriah is the place where the temple was built. So I will tell you this, we're not sure until again, Chronicles is a fairly late book of the Bible. So in the book of Samuel, it never says that Moriah is the same place as Jerusalem. So in Samuel, it doesn't say that or in the book of Kings, but it does mean have that association in the book of Chronicles, which was written later. So Moriah is like, as a root, is similar to the word for Torah, to teach. Like Morah in Hebrew means a teacher, but it also has it also is it becomes associated with, again, with Jerusalem as being a place of teaching. But I will tell you, the fact of its ambiguity probably allowed for initially not that it didn't have to be in the land. It didn't have to be in any one tribal portion to begin with, but again, is it possible was the same place? Maybe. It definitely is in walking distance from where he was the last point, which would be Beersheba. It is walking distance, but it's a pretty long walk, right? And as we're going to see, it's possible. I mean, it's possible that they walk from Beersheba. It's possible. Israel's not a big country, so it's possible. But all of these things, again, just in the first couple of verses, the last part really of this last verse, to offer him up as a burnt offering, ha'alehu sham la'olah. It's pretty, the one thing I do want to point out there, it's pretty specific that this is a burnt offering, which is why it's translated as burnt offering. And in olah, and again, you consider ha'alehu to offer him up as an offering. You can see the word olah there twice. It means it's the same word as aliyah, it's the same root as to go up. There's a real question of again, some people say, does Abraham wonder what's going to happen to him when he gets there? Like, is he testing God, right? And again, that could be maybe understood if he said, I want you to sacrifice your son, or I want you to offer up your son, in a more nebulous way, like what is it? But the word alehu and olah, that's a burnt offering. That's not like, well, we're going to tie him up and test him, or we're going to tie him up and put him to, we'll see what happens to him. A burnt offering is, he's done. I mean, he's gone. He's being offered up in fire, and there wouldn't be anything left but ashes. So this idea that somehow, like, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, that's not what the text says. Some people, especially the rabbis, who are uncomfortable with this in history, throughout history, thousands of years ago, rabbis are uncomfortable with the fact that God even does this to Abraham. They try to make it seem like we're not sure. Abraham's not really sure what's going to happen to him when they get there. It's it's a big stretch to say that's not what's happening here, because it seems like the word olah is repeated there, like the verb and the noun is there. So it seems like he knows Abraham is being told what's going to happen. So it says in the next verse, Vayaskem Avraham. Early the next morning, Avraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place of which God had told him. Now, the word Vayaskem, we talked about when we looked at Avraham circumcising himself. The word is an important word in Hebrew, because it has a connotation not just of doing it, but that he got up early. He arose early. He got out of bed early. Baboker. He didn't wait. And so the rabbis like to point out that Avraham teaches us through his actions, circumcising, doing this thing, that even when Avraham is called to do something difficult, he doesn't procrastinate. He doesn't wait. And he has very good reason too. These are not easy things to do. Circumcising yourself, sacrificing your son, these are not things that most of us are called ever to do. Yet he doesn't hesitate. He gets up early to do it, which, by the way, is one of the traditions of why we are supposed to do mitzvot in the morning, right? We don't wait until afternoon to do them. We're supposed to, if possible, do a brit, to do a circumcision or a covenanting ceremony. We're supposed to do them in the morning because Avraham did it in the morning. We don't dawdle. And so, especially when we're doing a mitzvah, we're supposed to get to it and not put it off till later in the day, if you will. We vayaskem, like Avraham, we get up early. So as he goes up with two of his servants, the rabbis like to point out maybe these two people are Ishmael and Eliezer. Why? Because we know that there's two people in the household who are older than Yitzhak, but that are people that we know. The rabbis don't like unnamed people. They don't like the ambiguity of who these two servants are. So they like, and it's not road doesn't necessarily have to be servants. They could be two young men. And so I'm not sure that I like the translation of servants, but needless to say, they like the idea that the two guys are walking along in the rabbinic midrashic mind. You can imagine what the purpose of this is, right? These two guys are going to walk along going, oh my gosh, think about how lucky we are. We were worried that Isaac was going to inherit everything, and now Isaac's going to be sacrificed. This is the greatest news ever. You know, they're walking behind the two of them, high-fiving each other, going, he's gone, right? So that's the way the rabbinic mind went with the fact that if these two people are doing this, they're only too happy to go along with them. Let me see. I'm just looking. Yeah, the Friedman translation just says two. Na'arav actually is his two boys. So Na'arav is his boys, which is why they translate it as servants, because it's like servant boys. But the rabbis like the idea that they're even more like Abraham's boys, right? They're Abraham's boys, Ishmael and Eliezer, the two people who he's kind of already said, maybe they're my inheritors. So they like the word Na'arav, which two of his servants rather than two of his boys. Anyways, a little bit on the specifics of that translation.
It's such a deeply disturbing kind of idea too, that like, I mean, these are essentially his brothers. So it's not just his father who's willing to sacrifice him, but also his brothers.
Yeah.
Feels just a little like Joseph.
Yeah.
Too.
And the thing, of course, that we have to be confronted with, and even at this moment, and depending on how old Isaac is, which we're going to see in the next, we don't know how old Isaac is yet. Well, we never know, but we don't even know if he's like a baby at this point.
Oh yeah, his own complicity in it, right?
Yep. But before we even get to that point, as you're pointing out, these two guys are with him. Do they have a vested interest in this going through? But again, one of the bigger issues that we've already have seen at this point, because the next verse is the next part of this verse. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place of which God told him. So he splits the wood. So he actually gets the wood ready for this. So at this point, he's not only taken his boy, he's on his way with the servants, with Isaac. And up until this point, Abraham hasn't said anything, right? So Abraham argues for Sodom and Gomorrah, for cities which he knows, we know, God knows are not good people. And yet he doesn't say anything to God about, why are you asking me to sacrifice my child? Nothing. And so this is a very interesting, like, where is that, right? Where's Abraham's distress, which is why, we have that midrash that he argues with God. Which son? What are you talking about, God? You got to be more specific, because at least that gives us a possibility that Abraham isn't like isn't so willing, or at least so complicit in this. And so this is something that Abraham has already proven he can argue with God, at least on behalf of other people, but he's not arguing on behalf of his own family. So does he really think God is going to let him? I mean, these are all possibilities here, but at least at this point, Abraham hasn't said a word to God other than Hineni. He hasn't said anything. God's given him instruction. And so far he's behaving a lot like Noah.
Yeah, it just has the feeling of it's an older part of the Torah. You know, I just have the feeling it's an older portion, like you're saying with Noah and.
Yeah. So these are all things that yeah, we're kind of left with this story, at least up until now. So he splits the wood for the burnt offering, right? And it says on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. So we know that it's 3 days by the fourth verse. We don't know how far, exactly he can cover in those days, but let's say 20 miles. Could have been quite a bit of places within a 60-mile radius of Beersheba, if that's where he was. We don't know that he even was at Beersheba when he set out at that point. We don't know how much time has passed. We don't know where Abraham is sojourning at that time. So it really could be almost anywhere in the land of Israel. As a 3 days journey by donkey is 60 miles, 60, 70 miles perhaps. So it could be almost anywhere. But it says that Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar, right? So he sees where he's going to on the third day. And it does sound a little bit like kind of the verses that we have in the Noah story. And Abraham said to his servants, "You stay here with the ass. The boy and I will go up there. We will worship and we will return to you." Now, what's interesting about this is that, well, you tell me what you find interesting about that verse. Anybody, give me some of the stuff that you just saw in that one verse, verse 5. Anybody? Throw out something you just saw in that verse. I mean, obviously, he tells the servants or the boys, again, it's old Na'arav, his boys, go back. You stay here. You're not coming up. But what do you see here?
Well, if it says the boy and I will go up, it means it's an older boy, right? The boy is able to walk up himself.
So that's part of it, yeah.
But then we will return to you is the other part.
Yes. So what's key about that, Francine?
Well, I mean, he sounds like he thinks both of them are going to return.
Correct. It's no question about it in Hebrew. It says "Benishtachaveh," that we will worship. It's a plural. The nun means we, and nashuva means we will return. Which, by the way, nashuva doesn't only mean return. We will repent, but it's not. It's clearly will return to you, aleichem. But the word nashuva also means repent. We will repent, but nishtachaveh nashuva means, and you hear that phrase, it means we will pray and we will repent. But here it's clearly we will pray and then we will come back to you. But it's a phrase that, like, when you hear the word nashuva, it means more than just return. It means, repent, coming back better. But yes, as Francine pointed out, the we indicates that Abraham doesn't think that he's coming back by himself, or at least he doesn't want to tell these guys that he's coming back by himself. So there is a separation here, which, of course, if we follow the midrash that it is Ishmael and Eliezer, that there's a difference here that's being set aside, that's being set up right away here, which is that you guys are not this guy. This kid is different than you kids. So that's a possibility, but the bottom line is there is a separation here that we see that they don't go up the whole way. They're not going. This last part is just the two of them. And up until this time, God hasn't spoken to him, at least over these last days. Abraham hasn't spoken much. Actually, Abraham hasn't said anything, actually, until right now. He said to God, Hineni, and this is the first time that Abraham has said anything. So we don't know exactly what Abraham is. Everything else is speculation. We know that he got up early. We know he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. We know he's not arguing. But we don't know what he's thinking or what he's doing other than following God's commands until he says this. we will return to you. So, the next verse. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. He took himself the firestone and the knife, and the two walked off together. So wait, let me just see what the note is that they put on this. Literally the fire. Well, yes, because the word there, aish, seems to mean literally fire, but it can't be. I mean, I guess he could have lit a flame with them, but there is an understanding that there is not just a knife, but there's lighting implements, there's kindling, there's flint, whatever people used to do that, so that he sees a knife. That's one thing. But he also sees something for fire. Okay. And the two walked off together. Vayilchu shnehem yachdav. That phrase is one of the most powerful phrases in the Bible because it says the two of them walked off together. Now, again, you could say, well, it has to say together because they were just with, it just said there were other guys there. So now the two are walking off without them. But you can make the argument, but we know that. You've already said that they're not coming up. But there's something very powerful about that phrase, shnehem yachdav, the two together. Because there's two. It says shnehem. You could have just said vayilchu yachdav, they walked off together. But shnehem yachdav, that they walk off together, is a sense of they're going together with one common purpose. And so the rabbis point out that at least at this point, Isaac is totally on board with what's about to happen. The Yachdav signifies togetherness of not just that they're together, but that they're together in purpose. Look, it's also been pointed out by many people over the years that Abraham takes the knife and the firestone, or the fire, the torch, whatever it is for lighting, and the knife for the killing, but Isaac is the one who carries the wood, right? And so Isaac carrying the wood becomes a very important motif in art, right? Why is it so important? Why is Isaac carrying the wood such an important motif?
Well, it points out again that he's an older kid. He can carry all this wood.
Correct.
And that's his choice to carry the wood.
Yep. Why do people, especially, why do we have so many pictures like this in churches? Why does Caravaggio paint the binding of Isaac? Why do most Catholic churches, even to this day, have pictures of the binding of Isaac up in their churches?
The martyrdom of it, right, is connected to Jesus, but is carrying the wood like carrying the cross?
Oh yeah, it's not a coincidence. Isaac carrying the wood is prefiguring what Jesus will do later. And so Jesus carrying his cross is a revisiting of that motif, of the sacrifice of Abraham. So Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son, but God sacrificed his son. And so that's the difference. And that is why the story of the binding of Isaac is so important in Christianity, and specifically, again, in Catholicism, which focuses so much on the actual sacrifice of Jesus, right? The fact that that picture of Isaac carrying the wood, or Isaac being sacrificed, or almost being sacrificed, again, is so important because it's such an important part of the crucifixion later on in the story of Jesus. So the carrying of the wood is then amplified when Jesus carries the cross. And so that's one of the reasons why Christians loved this story of the binding of Isaac, because again, it leads us to the fact that, yeah, God doesn't call man at this point to do this, but later on God needs to do this because people still don't get it. And so God has to take the next step. And so God can't sacrifice, or God can't ask human beings to make that sacrifice, but God can make that sacrifice. So that's kind of the lesson from it. And that's one of the reasons why that story became so important. The interesting reading for us as Jews is the fact that what are you talking about? The martyrdom of Jews over the last 2,000 years in particular means that the sacrifice of God's son in the Christian story is nothing compared to the sacrifice of millions of Jews over the last 2,000 years by the Romans, by the church itself, by the Nazis, by the Soviets. Every time Jews are martyred, isn't that the sacrifice that Abraham sacrifice that didn't have to happen? And there's many poems, and especially again during the Crusades, we found Isaac constantly invoked by the people during the Crusades, saying, look at me, I'm holier than Abraham, because Abraham didn't have to sacrifice his son, yet my children were burned or murdered during the Crusades, or again during the Holocaust, or even in modern Israel, where people have written about young Jewish men and women who've been killed in battle and saying, look, my son was offered up as a martyr. So it's definitely part, the Isaac story becomes part of a reference point for Jews, and then of course for Christians for this. And again, a lot of it has the motifs of the carrying the wood, where Isaac is at this point, literally carrying the implements for his own destruction on his back, right? So whether it's a soldier carrying weapons into warfare, the backpack on his back, all those kinds of motifs that have been reinterpreted in the modern era. Very powerful, very sad.
Reading it backwards through the Christian lens does give this sense of Isaac knowing what he's going to do and his willingness to be that sacrifice. Whereas reading it forward through the Jewish lens, I think there is like an uncertainty, like a soldier going off to war, not knowing if they'll live or die or what's going to happen, but not knowing if they're going to be martyred. I mean, I feel like there's still a question through the Jewish lens of whether he knows or not, but through the Christian lens, seeing him as like the pre-Jesus figure, it does feel like he did know and he was willing to do it.
Yeah. Well, and again, everybody will reinterpret it. And as I said, Jews as well as Christians. I mean, Christians obviously did it with Jesus, but Jews have done it because every time a Jew is martyred, every time a Jewish man watched his own son be killed, he would say, for being Jewish, he would say, essentially to God, look, you didn't have Abraham didn't have to lose Isaac. I did lose my son. Right. And so there was that sense of I've paid a higher price even than our ancestor Abraham. So
of injustice, a sense of injustice, and the crime of it.
Yeah.
And it's such a deeply painful story.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Isaac at this point has not said a word, but the next verse, Isaac finally speaks up. Then Isaac said to his father Abraham, Vayomer Yitzhak el Abraham, Aviv, father. And he answered, yes, my son. What a horrible, horrible, horrible translation. What a horrible translation. Horrible. How can you not translate Hineni? How could you not translate the words Hineni? Vayomer Yitzhak el Avraham, Aviv, my father. Vayomer Avi, and the father, and it shouldn't be and he. It shouldn't be and he answered. It should be and his father answered. His father. I mean, that's so much more powerful to say. His father answered, Hineni, Hineni vini. Here I am, my son. I'm here, my son. He says, Hineni vini. I'm here, my son. Those two words, Hineni vini. I'm here. Here I am. yes, my son is okay, but it's totally missed the fact that he just said the word hineni to his son. The same word that he said to God, he's now said to his son. Hineni vini.
I mean, how are you supposed to interpret that?
Vayomer avi. He said, Father. And he said, and the father said back. And it doesn't even just say, and he said, and the father said. What?
How are you supposed to interpret that? Like he's saying, I'm as present for you in this moment, Isaac, as I am for God.
Yeah, I'm answering you with the same presence of mind, with the same intensity, with the same integrity, with the same conviction as I answered God. Yeah, I'm saying it as clearly and as powerfully as I said to God. Yeah. And now he says not just hineni, he says hineni veni. He says my son. So actually, in a way, he doesn't say, hineni Elohai. He doesn't say, here I am, my God. He says, here I am, my son. And that there's a level of intensity to that and recognition in that, which is even in a sense more powerful because he calls him my son. He doesn't just say, here I am, I'm here. He says, here I am, my son. And the conversation continues with Isaac saying, Vayomer hine, right? Hine, which is like hineni. Hine, here's the ash, here's the firestone, here's the fire, and here's the wood. Aye, where is the sheep or the offering for the burnt offering? Where is the animal for the offering? Where is the animal for the offering? That's what he says. Aye, where is it? So hine is here. Aye is where. And so the juxtaposition of hine and hineni with aye is very powerful too.
So the tension too between saying hineni to God and saying hineni to his son is, I think, that Hebrew captures the conflict that Abraham would feel in a way that it doesn't show in any other part of the story. Like we don't hear him. There's nothing that says he was in conflict, but being present for God in this request and being present for his son as the one he's going to sacrifice, that's such an intense conflict.
Well, it's amplified by the next phrase too, because look at this. Vayomer Avraham Elohim. God said, Elohim Yirelo. God will see to the sheep, right? It's not God will provide. God will see to the sheep, which is kind of a little bit more of an ambiguous way of saying it, right? God will provide the sheep. God will see to the sheep. God will see, Yirelo. So keep in mind that phrase is an interesting one. God will see to the sheep. That's an interesting phrase. God will see to the sheep. I'm just looking to see what how Friedman translated that. God will see to the sheep. But remember that phrase, Yirelo, God will see to the sheep for the offering. And then he says, my son. So he says the word beni again, which, as I said, amplifies the fact that he recognizes this and is saying beni. He doesn't have to say it again. Every opportunity he has in responding to his son Isaac, he says, my son. He says beni.
It reminds me of King David with Absalom when he dies and he says, my son, my son.
Yeah. My son, my son. There can't be much more of a powerful phrase for a parent to say in anguish of this anguish that he knows at this point. And again, does Isaac really not know in this? But he says, Bini, my son. So he doesn't have to say it. He doesn't have to say, he could simply have said, Yirelo haselo, that God will provide for the sheep to offer. And again, it ends with the phrase, Vayachu shnehem yachdav. And so it says it again. Didn't have to say it. And the two of them walked on together. Vayelchu shneichem yachdav. The two together. Two together. Shneichem yachdav. And that's repeated again. Doesn't have to be repeated. We know that there are only two of them together, but it says it again. So again, remember that phrase, those phrases that we've seen. Bini, yachdav, together. Yechidcha, we had Yechidcha already as your favored one or your only one. So Yachad has been there before too, Yachad. Right? And we have that phrase, Yirelo, God will see to it. And they arrived at the place which God had told him. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. They arrived at the place which God had told him. So they get to the spot. Abraham knows it's the spot. However, he knows his built-in GPS has told him this is the spot. I mean, he looked up at the mountain. He knew where to go. Abraham builds an altar there. So however it is to put the proper kindling and rocks around it, the altar is laid out. The wood is laid out. And it says he binds his son Isaac. And the Hebrew for that is vaya'akod, vaya'akod. And that's why we call this the akedah, the binding of Isaac, the akedah. It's from this word ya'akod, from binding. He binds him. Now, binding his son implies that maybe Isaac again wouldn't have done this willingly. I mean, the animals you definitely have to bind because the animals are not going to sit there as you slaughter them. So you tie up their legs, tie them up in a way so that they can't get out, tie them down. But Isaac is tied down too. And it says, bound his son Isaac, his son. It doesn't say just he bound Isaac. Et Yitzchak beno, he bound his son. And actually it says he bound him and then he placed him. So it actually is the binding takes place technically before he actually lays him out and places him on it. But I mean, you could make the argument vayas, the vayasem, the placing him is more like, turning him or he could have been bound onto the altar and then they placed him in the right position, whatever. I mean, the point is that this buildup of this moment is building an altar, laying out the wood, binding him down, and then putting him down on it. So everything is set up. I mean, it's not like, it's not ready to go. And it literally says at that moment that Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son, which is why in the pictures, in the artwork, that Abraham has the knife in his hand, because the Bible says he has the knife in his hand. So at least at this point, Abraham is taking this to the level that he is going to do this. There is not a question. He doesn't have the knife over to the side. And he's sitting there with God saying, when are you going to stop this? That Abraham literally puts the knife to slay his son, which means that he didn't just pick it up to some extent. And I mean, I guess you could say all he has to do is pick up the knife. But to slay his son means that he got so close to him in some interpretations. And I guess you could say you don't have to be that interpretive. When it says to slay him, is that he put the knife really close to his throat. So how close is he to do it? In most of the artwork and most of the imagination in the Midrash, this is literally at the very last moment, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and says, Avraham, Avraham, Vayomer Hineni. Well, thankfully, this time they translated it as here I am, which again, at least translate it the same way each time. But again, we can also translate it as I'm here. I'm here. Here I am. Yes, here I am. I'm here. And of course, the angel calls him out twice. Now, it's been pointed out before, why is it an angel? Why is the angel doing it and not God? Anybody want to offer any thoughts on why it's an angel? Anybody?
Well, an angel is a messenger, right?
Okay, but if God doesn't, why, if God can call him, why doesn't God stop him? Why is there an angel now doing it rather than God directly?
Well, maybe he's a messenger because maybe Abraham didn't hear God right. Maybe God didn't ask for that. Maybe a messenger has to come down to him in person and say, stop this. I mean, sometimes we think we hear God and we think we know what God wants, and sometimes we don't.
Other than the fact that it says that Abraham is told what to do from the beginning from God. God says, offer him up as I tell you. But I think you might be on the right track in that at least one possibility is that God isn't really happy that Abraham never spoke up and said, do you really want me to sacrifice my son? He doesn't do that. He doesn't argue about this. And so that maybe, we normally say that Abraham passes the test, but maybe the test wasn't whether Abraham would listen to God, but whether Abraham would argue with God. And so he fails the test. We always say, now, again, it seems as though by the response that God isn't upset with Abraham in the sense that I wouldn't say he failed the test, but maybe he got a C on the test. Maybe the test wasn't the answer. So it is possible that the angel comes because God is not 100% satisfied with Abraham. Now, anybody else want to offer any of their thoughts or insights on why the angel is popping up here?
Is it possible that God doesn't totally, is it possible that the angel could act on its own accord?
That's an interesting one. It's not, it has been, I will say that there is a insight that Abraham actually did sacrifice Isaac, and that later on, and way the story was kind of altered was that, and again, you'd say, like, how could that be? Isaac and it has to have kids. Well, maybe this happens after Isaac already had a kid or kids. So you're going to say, well, how's that possible? Well, it is possible, but that there's a later author that comes in and has an angel stop because they can't possibly have Abraham sacrificing Isaac, but that there was an earlier tradition that Isaac was indeed killed by his father. It's possible. It's not highly probable, but it is possible.
I remember someone coming to the to AJU who talked about the possibility of that that he was sacrificed, and that there was originally no connection between Abraham and Jacob, and that all of that was kind of added later.
I don't buy it, because there's too many other connections that are made that, like, you can't just sever that. But look, the problem is we don't have a lot of text about Isaac in the Bible, right? So it doesn't help that there's so much missing from Isaac Isaac's life, right? Because this is chapter 22. And in chapter 25, Jacob and Esau are born and are already at it. So there's 3 chapters about Isaac, really not really about Isaac at all, because the next chapter is about finding Rebecca, and Isaac is mentioned only at the very end.
I heard
We have nothing about Isaac.
I read
So-
an answer to Deborah that perhaps Isaac had Down syndrome, that he was born from an older mother, and that he was just not very sharp. You know, he doesn't talk very much. He doesn't interact very much.
Definitely, there's been, let's put it this way, there have been definitely people trying to imagine why Isaac is got, he has PTSD, he has all these, there's all these possibilities of why Isaac is the way he is, including, again, going back to this. Look, there's a possibility that an angel comes here now, because to some extent, the angel is coming in front of Abraham and Isaac hasn't talked to God yet. And so when God comes to the 2 of them together, God isn't going to speak to both of them at the same time. Instead, an angel kind of is the manifestation of the angel is the manifestation of God, which allows both of them to simultaneously see, to understand God. So the angel is kind of a manifestation that Isaac can also wrap his head around, because Abraham's talked to God, but Isaac at this point hasn't.
Does Isaac ever have conversations directly with God? I don't remember.
No.
I mean, throughout any of his stories, does he
No.
ever speak directly?
No.
Oh,
No. So
that's interesting.
yeah, when
Because Jacob definitely speaks directly to God, and Abraham does, but maybe Isaac doesn't have the connection with God that they do.
other than the fact that the only time, so Isaac never has a conversation with God. The rabbis like the idea that Isaac is like holier than everybody else, which is wild because we don't really know anything about him. Isaac pleads to God on behalf of his wife when she's pregnant. But it doesn't say, it says God responded to his plea. It doesn't say that God answered him or God spoke to him or whatever. This is only communication with God. And it doesn't say he spoke to God. It says he prays to God, pleaded with God is actually the actual words. This is Vayater Yitzchak L'Adonai. That's the only time that Isaac talks to God at all, praise. But the assumption actually is that he's a very holy guy. Isaac is considered by the rabbis to be the paradigm of virtue and the paradigm of living a righteous life, partly because he lives longer than everybody else. He lives to 180, which is longer than his father and longer than his son. He also is only married one time, right? The other guys are married to more than one woman, have
And
children.
he doesn't try to sacrifice his children or sell his
Doesn't
wife.
try to, well, he does. No, he does. Unfortunately,
He does?
there's an Isaac and Rebecca story with an Avimelech as well. Maybe not the same Avimelech. So no, there is unfortunately that scene, but it's not as well. It's not maybe as complicated as his father's scenes, but and there is only one. But there is also, so there is that. But he has only married one, and he's the only patriarch, my friends, that doesn't leave the Holy Land. He never leaves Israel. And so the rabbis really like the fact that Isaac is true to the land and he's true to his family, I guess, to some extent, in the sense that he doesn't have other wives. But he is never leaving Israel, right? Because Abraham, first of all, didn't even start in Israel, and he goes down to Egypt. Jacob goes up to Aram to get his wives, and he goes down to Egypt, which is where he dies. He spends the last part of his life in Egypt, but Isaac never leaves the Holy Land. Now, the rabbis partly say that's because of his virtue and that he wouldn't leave the land, even when there was famines or problems in his time, he wouldn't leave. But there's also this kind of understanding, like he's blessed, and because he's blessed, maybe even going back to his faith here, the fact that he doesn't get up, tries to get out, goes along with this, that he's honored by his fear, his trembling before God, if you will, that he is never forced to leave the land of Israel. He's never tested in those ways, because essentially he already got tested. So he kind of paid the ultimate price. And so he doesn't have to do those things. He doesn't suffer the way his father and his son suffer. So these are all like kind of midrash, kind of like, well, what can we say about him? We can't say anything about him really from the text, because he's not mentioned in the text that much, Isaac. There's so little, as we're going to see in the next couple of weeks. We don't even know what to say. We have to kind of extrapolate and imagine and kind of, explore midrashically in our imagination what his life was like, because we just don't have it. But he's there when the angel stops him. We don't know, by the way, that Isaac actually sees the angel, though we can assume that he does. We don't necessarily know he does.
It's really interesting that he ends up blind, because I don't know, it's just that there's something there about like that he doesn't see it.
Yeah.
Maybe he doesn't see it coming with what his dad's going to do. He certainly doesn't see it coming with what Jacob's going to do. And maybe that's why he doesn't really relate to Jacob as much, because Jacob's so much more like Abraham than he is like Isaac.
Could be.
He certainly takes after his grandfather, where Esau seems much more like Isaac.
That's what I'm saying. He just seems slow. Do you know that he just doesn't quite get
Well,
it?
he definitely is. He definitely is. Seems to be. Well, we don't know. He doesn't argue with God. He definitely doesn't seem to take too many matters into his own hands. But here's the picture. In the picture in Caravaggio, and again, I wish that have glare. You know what? Why am I even doing that? I'll just share it up on the screen. The angel actually grabs, in the Caravaggio painting, the angel actually grabs his hand, which I think is really a great image. Look, if Abraham, so this painting, by the way, the one that I always show up, that I like, the Caravaggio one, is actually in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. So if you ever go to the Uffizi, please stop by the Caravaggios.
Did you see it in person?
Oh yeah. But one of the craziest movies in the world, which like I think about a lot, is the movie Serious Man, Coen Brothers.
Oh yeah.
Which is a kind of their meditation on the book of Job. And they show this painting in the rabbi's office, which I always thought was kind of like spooky, because I saw a screening of it right before it came out. I went to see it, and my dad was invited to the screen, and I got to go with him. And when they showed the painting, and they actually do a close-up of the painting, they do they show the rabbi's office, and they show that painting. I was like, how did they know that? That's my favorite painting. So you can see in the Caravaggio, the angel actually grabs his hand, takes his hand. And
Caravaggio was known for this intense contrast with light and dark.
Yeah.
In the way that he highlights things. And it's looking at that painting and where your eye goes, that it first hits the shoulder of the angel, going to the hand that hits the face of Abraham, coming back down to the hand of the angel, going to the shoulder of Isaac, and then the with the knife, and then the press of Abraham's hand. I mean, it's just got this beautiful kind of movement, and it intensifies as it goes down.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that the angel's hand is, the finger is pointed out below, kind of, like it's being paralleled with the knife, and the fact that the angel's hand is grabbing on Abraham, over Abraham's hand, which is again on Abraham's other hand is on Isaac's neck. So it's the balance of the two. You can almost feel
you can definitely feel the push of like Abraham's finger into Isaac's face as like having as much strength as the angel's hand pulling his knife away.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
the press of that, like the pressure of those 2 points.
Yep. Yeah. It is, to me, it's, I mean, look, there's a lot of paintings of the binding of Isaac. This one not only sticks out as one of the great paintings of the Akedah. To me, it's one of the most powerful paintings of any biblical painting of any artist.
You know what else too? The naked shoulder of the angel and the naked shoulder of Isaac, kind of it like, because they're the two, it's like the two of them have that in common, the innocence of it, the purity of it.
Yeah.
That angel, that he's like the angel.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. Well, Francine just asked the question, an important question. Do we know the angel's name? Is it Gabriel? Is it Michael? We don't know. The angels are not named in the early parts of the Bible. Actually, not really in the Bible at all until we get to the book of Daniel. We don't get angels named. As a matter of fact, in Genesis, as we're going to see in a couple of weeks, when Jacob wrestles the angel says, "You can't know my name," right? The naming of angels is actually a later tradition, and actually kind of gets into some of the angelic mythology, which is that when you know the angel's name, then you can invoke it and call it. But there's something powerful about Isaac, the sacrifice, which again calls into question why Abraham doesn't do anything. Abraham has proven he can speak on behalf of the people of a nation, of a city, even a wicked city, but yet he doesn't do anything for his own family. And so there's this question of does Abraham really get it? Is Abraham too focused on the bigger mission and not on his own needs for his family, right? Which again calls into question whether a rabbi, a religious leader, a politician, the people who say they're doing these bigger projects, but are they leaving behind their family, right? Are they sacrificing their own children? And I think it's a very fair question for people to ask themselves, or for us to ask as we read this story. Is Abraham missing the point? Because if God is calling on us and on Abraham to change the world, is he completely blind to his responsibilities to protect his own family, right? And so does Abraham miss the point, which is that as much as he has to argue on behalf of the macro picture, right, the bigger picture, he must protect his family. And maybe the angel comes because Abraham doesn't get that yet, right? And so maybe that gets back to this question of what happens.
I just get back to, he came from a civilization that did human sacrifice, and all the people around him did human sacrifice. I guess we were one of the first peoples that didn't do human sacrifice. So to him, this is probably par for the course. That it seemed like a normal type of thing. And like I said, maybe he heard God wrong, or maybe I don't know. But the angel comes along and stops it. It's a stopping point from us doing human sacrifice. Yeah. God is saying we need to sacrifice our children.
So as you can see, we've kind of frozen at this scene because we have to, right? Because at least at this moment, Abraham is ready to sacrifice his son, and is about to sacrifice his son until the last minute. And there's a very famous way that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the great voices of the last century, described this. He said, Heschel describes the experience of a 7-year-old who hears the Akedah for the first time. Isaac was on his way to Mount Moriah with his father. Then he lay on the altar bound, waiting to be sacrificed. My heart began to beat even faster. It actually sobbed with pity for Isaac. Behold, Abraham now lifted the knife, and now my heart froze within me with fright. Suddenly the voice of the angel was heard. Abraham, lay not thine hand upon the lad, for I know that you fear God. And here I broke out in tears and wept aloud. Why are you crying? Asked the rabbi. You know that Isaac was not killed. And I said to him, still weeping, but Rabbi, supposing the angel had come a second too late. And the rabbi comforted me and calmed me by telling me that an angel cannot come late. And the angel says, do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him, for I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. And that is the words that Abraham is told at that moment. So it seems at the face of it that Abraham passes the test. But again, Abraham has now spoken to God and said, Hineni. God has spoken to his son and said, Hineni. And now God has spoken to the angel and said, Hineni. And each time he says, Hineni, Abraham, each time, is actually asserting something that's very important for us as Jews. We have to listen to God. We have to listen to God's voice. But we also have to listen to our family voices, the voices of human beings, of the people around us. And what the angel represents is the intersectionality of the human and the divine, because that's what an angel is. The angel is the manifestation in human form of God. It's what God appears to, or the way God speaks to us in this world is as an angel, is angelic, but it's God. It's clearly God, because God says, from me, from me. And so God is saying, I know that you will listen to me, that you fear me. But it's important that, and Judaism teaches us that you can't just listen to God. You have to listen to human beings too. There has to be the place where God and humans both are heard by your ears. Because if you just listen to God, then you can go around sacrificing people. You can go around destroying life because God told me to do it. But you have to listen to humanity. You have to listen to the voices of people around you. And you have to be able to say, is this really the way God would want me to treat other people? Or I can't use my faith as a justification for not listening to other people. You can't go, well, I can't pay attention to those people living on the streets because I'm serving God. I don't have time for this. And Judaism teaches us that as much as we have to listen to God, we also have to listen to people. And the intersectionality, the point where those meet, is where Abraham is when this is over, where the angel says, okay, I get it. Hopefully you get it. And from this point on, God does not demand, or God is not going to essentially ever put people in the situation where they have to choose between humanity and God. There's not going to be any human sacrifice. And again, some people say the purpose of this story is to assert why Judaism prohibited human sacrifice. Because even Abraham, who would have been called to do human sacrifice, is told not to do human sacrifice. So maybe the greatest part of this story is actually to teach people from an early time, when everyone engaged in human sacrifice. Judaism does not demand human sacrifice. From this point on, which is from the beginning, don't do it. So we understand your desire to do it, by the way. That's the other thing we always like to point out when we talk about human sacrifice in the ancient Near East, which again, every Canaanite city we found, there are places where they offered human sacrifice. Every place that we know of that the Phoenicians went to, whether it was in Egypt or whether it was in Tunisia or whether it was in Spain, human sacrifice. That was the norm. And Judaism said, no, God doesn't require it. We know you're doing it because you love God or your gods. We know that you're doing it so that you can ensure that your other children will be born healthy. But God doesn't demand this. Even if you had one child and your child, you had to invest everything in this child, and so that, you're going to, what better child is there to offer up? You can make the argument. Nope. Even the holiest, the first Jew doesn't do this. You don't do it either.
So this made us special from the people around us.
Yep. And so a lot of people feel that this is the
Did the
point of the
Egyptians
story.
sacrifice?
Um,
I don't remember.
they did, from the standpoint of they had no issue burying people alive with their pharaohs.
Ah,
Now, did they see that as human sacrifice or whatever? I mean, they believe that people were going into the next world, but I don't know. I'm sure people who did human sacrifice believed that the Canaanites believed that those people were going to be rewarded in the next world. Look, people who are flying planes into buildings believe they're going to heaven. So Judaism really believed that human sacrifice, even for the sake of God, is not okay.
Yeah.
And so this is what makes Judaism different, is this commitment not to dying. You know, again, are people sacrificed? Yes. Not willingly, not because they want to. Are they martyred? Yes. And this is the thing that's so scary, is that we live in a world, and in Heschel's story, where the rabbi tells people, tells the rabbi tells the boy that an angel can't be late. The corollary, the part of that we have to remember, is that people are not angels. People can be late. And so there's an element to this which is frightening, because do we get to save a person? Not always. We're not angels. Sometimes a person is late. So
I remember learning this story. I was less than 10. I know I was in my grandmother's house with my dad, and we argued about it. I was so mad. How could God ask Abraham to do this? What kind of God does that? And I remember my dad saying, maybe he takes him that far to show him that he doesn't have to, like all the way right up to the edge, to prove to him that this is not what's needed.
yeah. And you know, as Rabbi Sachs, who we studied for so long too in our, within our Torah study, Rabbi Sachs, taught from the Akei Dais, is the most powerful lesson. Why we read this at Rosh Hashanah is that a civilization is judged by the way it treats its children, and to some extent, that's one of the things that we say in Judaism, is that the way that we feel about the next generation is that they will hopefully do better, and that we invest our hopes and dreams forward and not looking backwards. And so this is what Abraham teaches us in this, and what God, teaches us through this situation, is that this was something that Judaism made a break from, which is the norm of child sacrifice. And again, when people had 30-40% of children were dead on arrival, if you will, you can understand why people resorted to child sacrifice, because they said, look, maybe if I offer my first child up, then all the rest of my children will be healthy. I mean, that was the twisted logic, but there was a logic to it from the standpoint of, well, I have to offer up my first to God because that's my best, and that's what whatever this is going to show my faith for the rest of the time. If I offer up my fourth kid to God, it's not like I showed my faith. I already have 3 other kids, So this was the kind of logic that people had.
You think, how is a Jewish nation supposed to respond to another group of people that will put weapons, will strap their children with bombs and send them out to warfare?
Yeah. How do you fight against a culture and civilization that's so radically
How do you respect
different?
that culture? How do you even try to make peace with a culture that is so fundamentally against that Jewish value?
Yep. And again, one that will essentially sell its children down the river for the sake of, again, destroying your enemy. And again, we'll see that in the story in the Book of Kings, where another foreign king offers up his son as a sacrifice in battle. That people did that. I mean, the story seems to be pretty real, and pretty scary that that's what people did. So it says Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. And so Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in the place of his son. And Abraham named that site Adonai Yireh, whence the present saying, on the mount of the Lord there is vision. And again, remember the phrase I told you, Adonai Yireh, which is the Lord will see, right? That's the words that we saw back in verse 8, Adonai Yireh. So again, Adonai Yireh means God will see, on the mount where God will see. Again, it can be translated on the mount of the Lord there is vision, which means we get to see. But it all goes back to this, God will see to the offering, right? God will see to it. God will make it happen. God will help us see.
It makes that line, God will see, almost like a prayer, like see my son and don't let him be the offering.
Yep.
And then when God answers that prayer, it becomes the name of the mountain.
Yes. And that is why the name of the mountain, Adonai Yireh, is why you have to go back to verse 8, right? And say, and that, I mean, look, they have the note. I mean, it says see verse 8. So at least in the footnote, it says that, but you really need to, you need to say that there. It says,
because it's an answered prayer.
Yeah. And so that's why the Hebrew, and that's why, again, we took a few moments to look at this in greater depth, because you got to see this word Adonai Yireh, that this is now the name of the place. The site becomes Adonai Yireh. So now if this is Jerusalem, folks, if this is the place that becomes the holy city and the place of holiness for the Jewish people, it becomes a place of vision. It becomes a place where God either will help us see or God will see us. And the word Yireh, which means, again, you can see, will see, right? So there is that sense of potentiality, right? And the hope that there will be vision. And so it's not there is vision or there was vision, but that there will be vision. And so there's this sense of looking into the future, looking into the possibilities, the potentiality. And again, that's what we hope when we talk about what makes Judaism different too, is it's not just, and again, part of that is through the next generation, is seeing the next generation as being able to do better. It's to have more potential, is to hope that they have better opportunities. But it's this idea that again, it's in the future. And that's why, we talk about Hatikva, we talk about the hope, or we talk about, when we talk about Israel being a forward-thinking country, as much as it's an ancient country, we celebrate Israel's ability to see the future and to be, on the cutting edge of technology and all the great insights and innovations that Israel is bringing to the world. This is what it means to see that there's vision, right? That this is what it means that there will be a way to see the future, and that there will be the answers to those prayers, which again, whether it's, the next vaccine or the next, the next technology that'll help us get to the next place. I mean, look, what's the vision? What's a vision of Israel? Vision is the app Waze, which we use all the time to help us get to the next place, so we can see how to get from point A to point B. So that was developed right in Israel, Waze. So all of those technologies and all of those ways that Israel helps us see the future is part of that fulfillment and that continuation of that prayer, Adonai Yireh. And it says, Vayikra malach Adonai el Avraham shenit. Is it God called, the angel of the Lord called Avraham a second time from heaven, and said, by myself, I swear, the Lord declares, because you have done this and not withheld your son, your favored one, I will bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the heaven and the sands on the seashore, and your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. And all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants, because you have obeyed my command. Now, this is a fulfillment of what we read about in chapter 12, what we read about in chapter 15 again, and the covenanting, the covenanting scene, all of these, reframing and repetitions of this blessing for your descendants. Look, the people who take away the fact that maybe there was a sacrifice here is the fact that if the Torah literally just went when the angel called him the first time. So if this story or this part of the story where it says the angel of the Lord called from Abraham and Abraham said, Hineni, if these 1, 2, 3 verses don't exist, or 4 verses to 14, if it just says Vayikra Malach Adonai al Avraham, if it just said God said, I by myself I swear because you have done this and not withheld your son, your favored one, it would seem as though Isaac was indeed sacrificed. And so some people say that those few verses were inserted and changed the way the story originally existed, which is why, as Sarah said, we have people who walk around who say the story didn't originally, the version of the story hasn't been sacrificed because of this time, the second time. So this second time was really just the way it really was. It seems as though Abraham goes through with it and he gets blessed. The problem is that every reference then to Isaac that ever exists is as being part of the chain and being Jacob's son, Jacob's father, that Jacob is connected to Isaac and then Isaac to Abraham, that all of that at one point didn't exist. And I think there's a little bit of that's a little too steep of a hill for me to climb on that. But
Yeah, and also, I just wouldn't want to be a part of a Judaism where he did die.
Yeah. Now, there is an understanding in traditional Judaism, my friends, that Isaac did in fact die. Now, you're going to say to yourselves, well, but the Midrash clearly doesn't have Isaac dying. Well, yes and no, because there is a Midrash that Isaac's soul actually departed from him as he was about to be sacrificed, that Isaac was essentially scared to death. His soul left his body, and only God, through the angels and divine power, the soul gets returned back to him and he comes back to life. So he did die for a second. He had a near-death experience or a death experience. The soul gets returned to him. So Abraham didn't kill him, but he did die, but he does get reborn, if you will, or he gets restored, and he does live.
Resurrected.
I wouldn't say resurrected, but definitely restored. His soul comes back to him, but that he did die for a moment, which is why he did die, but he didn't really die. He walks back. But let's hold off until we were done. And we're almost, as you can see, took the whole time to read this tonight because we did it with very deep reading. Because here it says, my friends, the next line, Abraham then returned to his servants and they departed together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Where the heck is Isaac? So it is not so easy to understand that he didn't die because he's not there. But so the people who say that these lines here are from an author and before that these lines got put back in, that's where they say, well, they never changed this. They never changed this. They didn't change this verse. Where does Isaac go? It says sometime later, Avraham was told, Milcah too has borne children to your brother Nahor, Uz the firstborn and Buz his brother, and Kemuel the father of Aram, and Chesed and Chazo and Pildash and Yidlaf and Betuel. And Betuel being the father of Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Avraham's brother. And his concubine, whose name was Reumah, also bore children, Tebah, Gaham, Gahash, and Makkah. And that, my friends, is the end of the chapter. And the next lines are the lifetime of Sarah was 127 years. And that is what we're going to read next week. But don't go anywhere, because if Sarah's 127 when she died, then the rabbis kind of calculate that if Sarah is 90 years old when Isaac is born, then the oldest that Isaac could be at this point is 127 by 37. Sorry. If she's 127 when she dies, 90 when he's born, then he can't be old. He can't be older than 37 at this point using that math. We know he doesn't have kids yet, but that again is assuming that this is chronologically following right after. Doesn't matter. The point is that Isaac does not seem to have children at this point. If I asked you how old Isaac was during the sacrifice, you might give me different answers. You would probably not give me 37, but you'd probably say he's a young man. He's a teen, maybe a young teen, maybe 10, maybe 11. He's old enough to talk to his dad, but doesn't seem to be in his 30s. But
well, he's young enough for his dad to pin down and sacrifice him.
Well, if he's willing to go along with it, then he could be 30 when this happens. But the rabbis tend to say sometime between the ages of about 10 and 37 seems to be, where they're comfortable. Look,
and there's some connection there. I've heard before about the age of Jesus when he is sacrificed.
Well, yeah, you definitely would be in his 30s, right? When Jesus came to the end. But
and that it's supposed to be connected to like the age of Isaac when he was sacrificed. But that's only if Sarah dies immediately after he was
exactly
pinned down.
Which the rabbis like to point out that she did die immediately after, which is why that's a possibility. Look, if he's older, then the fact that he doesn't go right back with his dad could be, hey, you know what, Dad? We're not going back together. So every time that it says they two walk back together, now it doesn't say they walk back together. Maybe. But
on another point, as we find out, is he never talks to his father again, at least not in the Bible.
That is true.
Right.
They do not have another They do not have another conversation. Abraham plans the wedding, which we read about in the next portion in Chayei Sarah. So what we have is in this past Torah portion, Vayera, we had the birth of Isaac and the near sacrifice of Isaac. That's the birth and bar mitzvah story, if you will. We have the death story, and then we have a wedding story. So within these portions, we have the full life cycle. We have all the things celebrated. And again, he is
Isaac's like,
the rabbis
Dad, you better really be something.
Yeah, the rabbis like to point out that wonderful thing happens to Isaac at the end. Isaac goes through a very traumatic experience, but he does learn something, or we learn something for Isaac, which is that because he had to go through such a traumatic experience, what do we read? We read about the birth of Rebecca, or not the birth of Rebecca, but that we read about Rebecca. And why do we have this whole genealogy of Nahor's family, right? Of Abraham's brother's family? Who cares, right? Like, they're Arameans, they're not our family. But yes, they are our family, because Bethuel is Rebecca's father. And we read about this guy who is essentially Abraham's cousin's child, right? So they're from the same family group, same family tree. They're not sister and brother, or necessarily even on the first generation of cousins. But what's wonderful about this is that we know that he's going to have, we read about her birth, or we read about her family and her potentiality. And actually we read her name. It doesn't just say Bethuel. It doesn't just say Bethuel is born, but we read about Rebecca. We're named, Rebecca's called out. Rebecca, essentially this wonderful, and she really is an amazing lady. Rebecca is given to us by name. And so even though the story is very sad and problematic and it's upsetting and complex and everything else,
what does Rebecca mean again?
What does
the name Rebecca mean again? Doesn't it mean bound?
So yes, so there's a question of whether Rebecca's name is connected to this portion at all, right? So through her naming. So it's a very good point, Sarah, because her connection to the Akedah, and I always, whenever we read this portion at Rosh Hashanah, I always like to say, because it's a hard portion, even when I'm reading it fast and discussing it fast, it's a draining portion. It really takes a lot of energy out of me. And Rebecca is one of my favorite people in the Bible. And when I get to her name and I read this list of names, and again, you're reading them, and Utz, Becharo, and Buz, and Kemuel, and Aram, and Chesed, and Yechaza. You're reading these names, and they're such weird names. Pildash, Yidlaf, Petuel. You're reading through these names, and you're like, ugh, these are so, it's like, I'm never going to read these names except for here. And then you get to Rebecca, and all of a sudden, you remember that this portion introduces us to Rebecca, and she is one of the few matriarchs, one of the few women in the Bible that we read is loved by her husband, specifically, like literally falls in love with her the first time he sees her. And her name means captivating, or literally like we're caught by her. And we're kind of caught by her immediately, because again, as much as Isaac is caught by her, we're caught by her when we read her and read her name. And it's a, as we read about her in the Bible, that she is a formidable woman. She's a woman who is one of the great matriarchs, and is I think one of the great, we don't in a sense, though, we know more about her than we know about Isaac. You can make the argument, but we don't know a lot about Rebecca, but we know enough about her, and she just seems like just a great woman and great hero. And so it's a great moment when we get introduced to her here in a portion where, like, at the very least, it's draining. It's super, super emotionally draining to read this story, and not, you cry, you kind of tear up, and at the relationship between a father and son. And again, I'm not saying that daughters don't have that relationship too, but fathers and sons, the relationship that a father and son have is it's so powerful. It's always been powerful throughout the generations. And when you read this story, it's very hard for it's very hard for anyone to read it. So I don't want to diminish what it means for a woman to read the story, but for a boy to read this story, for a man to read this story, for anyone who's had a relationship with a father that is, and every relationship's complex. When you read this story, it's very difficult not to see yourself in the story. It's very difficult not to identify with the father, with the son. It's just very hard to read it and not to be touched by it, and to identify with it. Again, I'm not diminishing at all what this is for a woman to read it. But again, when you get to the Rebecca story, or the Rebecca identification, there is that hope, and there's that feeling like, you know what, things are going to be okay. If it wasn't okay for Isaac with his father at the end, which it might not have been, right? Maybe they never talked again, or maybe they didn't have good words to say to each other after that. Who knows? I mean, we those are all possibilities. But Rebecca is hope, and
Because
Rebecca,
ultimately the binding is one of love. He's bound to her in love,
yeah,
and captivated by love, rather than in that he doesn't die bound up and tied, as a sheep for his father's zealot. Instead he gets bound to a woman in love.
yeah,
Yeah. And that's like it feels healing. It feels like a beautiful healing. And I don't think there's any I don't think it's a mistake that her name is kind of like it's not the same root as Akida, but it's that it's a different version of being bound.
To be bound firmly, to be bound in a. Now, I will say one of the translations it says to snare. I don't like that translation as much, because that's like, being trapped. But to tie firmly, to join, captivating is I think probably what the intention of the name was. In Hebrew, a Semitic root for Rebecca was captivating. In the sense of, captivating personality, captivating beauty. And so, there's something, again, hopeful from this, but again, it's definitely a hard hard part of the Bible to read. It's obviously always thought provoking. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight in studying this. Man, I want to thank everybody for giving me even more to think about than I came into it. I'm most likely going to have a nightmare about this at some point tonight. I don't know if I'll remember the nightmare. Look, I have nightmares sometimes. I can't find my socks, so it's not like a nightmare is always a really reason to be scared. But I do think.
So is it going to be like Tebia's dream?
Yeah, I don't. Remember, he invented that dream. Like he didn't really have that dream. He just told Golden that he was having a dream. But yes, that was a terrifying dream, by the way. And when I was a kid watching that movie, I don't think I recovered easily from that. I think I said to my parents, "Why did you make me see that movie? I'm going to have nightmares of that nightmare. That nightmare is going to now be reflected in my nightmares."
Well, they did such a great job in the movie, the way they did.
It is
compared to the play.
It's so hard to do on a play, but yes, on the movie, they really hit it. And I know I might have nightmares tonight about it, but it's hard. And again, and by the way, I wish I could say it's now been 2 times that I've read this story since my father passed away, and it's difficult. It's difficult. It's not that it's gotten easier. When your father passes, at least from my standpoint, to read this and not have those feelings of identifying with it. And again, I think as a parent, I said I'll identify more with the parent as I got older. I could see it from the parent standpoint of Abraham, the parent, but I still have to say I really do see it as the son, as Isaac, and it's very hard. It's very hard for me ever not to see myself as Isaac. And again, I'm not going to get into the psychology of it and whether you see yourself bound in the drama that or the ways that your father creates for you or whatever. But it is I will say that it hasn't ceased to provoke intense feelings as I've read it, even after he passed. Let me just leave it at that. So again, I hope it gave everybody some and again, I did not expect, and I only spent the last few minutes talking about it from that standpoint of the son, but I'm sure daughters can have these feelings about their mothers. And I think that even though we have a daughter and mother together here at this moment, I don't want to get into that, but I will say
I couldn't imagine sacrificing my kid. No way. My daughter.
No, but I mean, just the fact I'm not going to speak on behalf of your daughter, but the fact that we
Children get bound up in their parents' values, though.
Yes,
they do.
Yes. And their parents' values, their parents' missions, if you will, and their parents' mishigas. And so and that we get bound up in sometimes reliving the same situations. So I don't want to get I don't want to open that up even more. And again, I didn't mean to diminish anybody of a different gender from having that feeling of a daughter with a father, with a mother with a son, but it is, for me, it's very deep, and it's a very deep thing for me to think about. So I hope everybody,
I
has
think it's a
more to think about.
powerful piece of human psychology. And I think it's great that you brought it up, and I think it's important to look at it from the father-son relationship, because there's plenty of stuff in the Bible that's mother-daughter and women, it's okay, I think, to just have a piece that is about the tension between father and son.
Yeah, no, again, but at the same time, I didn't mean to, and I'm not making an apology for him, but
I'm just
telling
saying,
you,
I don't feel that way that you did.
but it reminds us of how the Bible does not spare the psychology of these relationships, and again, hopefully teaches us to be, better parents, better children, better people. So thank you everybody for being here, and thank you everybody for being connected, for being bound together as a community, being hopefully bound together to good stuff. So take
In a
care, everybody.
Rebecca way.
Exactly, a captivating way. Stay healthy, everybody. Stay good, and we will see you hopefully in the next few days.
Thanks, Rabbi.
In person. Take care.